Hi guys, Chilibin here. Today I want to share with you my next make your own gear project. I'm making a two-person quilt. I've been thinking about making a quilt for a little while, and I really wanted to make a down quilt with a baffled design, and I thought seeing as Raiden and I are doing so much hiking together these days, it makes sense to make a two-person quilt. I did a bunch of research of two-person quilts online about the size and shape that they are, and used those to model my design. I really wanted a baffle design that wasn't sewn through so I could avoid those cold spots, and also was sewn in a way that would stop down migration throughout the bag. I'm going to show you my entire process from the planning right through until it's finished. Let's get started. Before I get to the sewing, I wanted to share with you a little bit of my planning process. I took the basic dimensions of a two-person quilt from what I found online, and then checked it against a couple of measurements of the bulk of our bodies lying on the ground. My measurements seemed similar to the two-person quilts online, so I went with their measurements because I figured they had more experience. Next I had to choose a baffle design. I like the idea of using a combination of vertical and horizontal baffles to keep the down in the most important areas. I saw a baffle design similar to the one I've used on a Make Your Own Gear forum online, but for a single quilt, so I modified it a little to make it work for my two-person design. I think overall I made the baffles a little more complicated than they needed to be, but I'm sure that all of my down is going to stay exactly where I put it, which is more important to me than simplicity of construction. I decided I wanted the quilt rated to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which, based on my internet research, meant I needed baffles of 2.5 inches. I think my baffles ended up being closer to about 2.25 inches, but they'll loft in the middle, so that will make up for it a little bit. Next I needed to work out how much down I required. To do this, I calculated the volume of the quilt in cubic inches, and then divided this volume by the fill power of the down to work out how many ounces of down I required. Then I increased this by 15% for overstuff, or extra down into the quilt to make it loft better and keep its loft longer. The last thing I did was write myself a set of construction notes. This was to help me remember some of the steps I was worried I might miss, but in the end I barely looked at these during the construction process. Okay, time to get constructing. The first thing I did was make my baffles. I made these out of 0.5 ounce per square yard no-seam mesh. I cut my fabric strips to 7 centimeters width, or 2.8 inches. Then sewed them all together in one really long line, so I didn't have to worry about joining them later. Next it was time for the outer and inner fabrics to be cut to size. I used 0.66 ounce per square yard membrane taffeta from Ripstop by the roll. I used red for the outside and black for the inside. I bought 4 yards of each fabric, which meant that I needed to cut it in half, so I had two 2-yard lengths and then sew it together down the middle. I trimmed off the excess fabric and then top stitched the seam flat. I pushed both pieces of fabric in one direction when top stitching them, so that the open holes wouldn't be exposed to the down. Next I did the same thing for the black fabric, which was the inside of the quilt. Now the more challenging part began. I started off by taping the outside fabric to the ground to make sure it stayed in one place, and then Raiden and I marked out the locations of all of the baffles using chalk on the inside of the fabric. I cut off the excess width of fabric and used some of the extra to make the neck baffle for the top. Then it was time to get sewing. I had to sew all of the baffles to the inside of the fabric along the lines that Raiden and I had drawn. This was a pretty tedious process, but I got better at it as time went on. And there we have it. There's all of the baffles sewn to the outside of the quilt. Next it was time to mark out the locations of the baffles for the inside of the quilt. Raiden and I did this exactly the same as we did for the outside. Then it was time to get sewing again. I needed to sew the other side of the baffles to the black fabric lining the quilt. I could only do this for about 2/3 of the quilt to begin with, and I'd need to do the rest once I'd half stuffed the baffles. This was definitely a downside to my design when it came to stuffing. It was at this point that I realised I'd missed sewing in a baffle, and that would mean I'd have to go back and unpick a whole pile of sewing to put it right. I'm not going to bother showing you that bit of video, so let's just skip to where it's all fixed and looking better. The last thing I did before I could start stuffing it was sew up the bottom baffle. I needed to get this fully enclosed so there's just a small hole to add the down in. Now it was time to start stuffing. This was a disastrous process to start off with. My first method was to stuff a tube full of down and then use a stick to push that down out into a baffle. It didn't go so well.
I just want to stick my hand in there and stuff it in there. What do you think?
It's gonna make a mess. You're gonna need it everywhere doing that. I'm not sure this is any better, but
I don't think this is any better. I think my tube is too small.
yeah. This isn't gonna work.
Oh.
You're getting it all over.
Okay, what we're gonna do, I'm gonna finish stuffing this single baffle. I don't even know what to do. This is why I was terrified of this process.
I didn't know it was gonna be this bad.
What?
I didn't know it was gonna be this bad. This is terrible. This stuff's like weightless snow. And it sticks to everything.
Mm-hmm. Seal this guy back up.
Your backdraft is going to cause trouble.
Okay.
That worked pretty well though, the suction.
Let's just try it.
Now, if you turn that on in there, is it going to pull the whole bag up at once?
No, because it's our vacuum's just not powerful enough for that.
Okay, if you say so.
I'm gonna have to put this in here. Because otherwise how am I gonna know how much I've vacuumed up?
That would work. Yeah, you'd have to take the bag off and weigh
do I
it.
just scoop a handful into the bag?
No.
Into the thing and then vacuum that up.
I'd avoid handful anything. It's not pulling enough.
It's not powerful enough for that.
That's the idea though. I think that's what you gotta do. I think you need a better vacuum. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need a bit of vacuum. Or some more Googling to figure out other ways of doing it.
Because that's the right approach right there, what you just did, I think. Because the handful thing is out. That's terrible.
Yeah.
And
so if we...
your tube idea, I don't think it's gonna work.
I think if we...
Unless, could you apply suction to the tube? Somehow?
Like put a piece of... I was exactly the same thing. Like if you had a vacuum tube with a tube of mesh.
You probably still need more draw.
I think our vacuum doesn't have enough suction to it.
Yeah.
But, so I've made a net tube. Of course, don't know how much my bag weighs. But I'm going to estimate it's about the same weight of mesh as that. So that's 5 grams of mesh and 3 grams of down. Problem being that the vacuum lost suction at that point. Because it couldn't pull through all of that down.
Yeah. How much do you need per baffle?
These baffles have got 21 grams in them.
So you gotta do that 7 times per baffle.
So what I did next, which ended up working for the rest of the quilt, was I set up my one-man tent inside our living room and shut the door behind me. Then I had free rein inside my tent to make as much mess as I needed to. I just used my hand to transfer down from the main bag onto the scales so I could weigh out as much as I needed for each baffle, and then used my hand to stuff it into the baffles. I think I lost a little bit over the way, but it worked pretty well. It was like being in a giant human-sized snow globe, especially when I started trying to vacuum it up, and the backdraft from the vacuum just made it spin everywhere. I started out by filling the horizontal baffles along the feet, and then the horizontal baffles through the middle of the quilt as well. Then I had to pin them all shut and go over to the sewing machine to sew the rest of the baffles in place before they could be stuffed. Doing this little bit of extra sewing meant that I had to get out of the tent, and that meant little tiny wisps of down found their way all the way across my apartment, in the kitchen, dining room, everywhere. Then it was back to stuffing so I could finish off the rest of the baffles. I tried to have a really good clean up with the vacuum before I got out of the tent for the last time. The next thing I did was sew shut the quilt along the edges. This meant that all of the down was sealed in place. And after distributing some of the down through the baffles, it looked pretty good. The next thing I did was finish off all the edges nicely. I started by going down both sides and putting a rolled hem on them. Then I sewed up the footbox using the zigzag stitch. The last bit to finish off was the hem along the top. This was a little bit more complicated. I put a drawstring and a sleeve on both sides, and then I put a neck baffle in the middle. The idea is that when it's cold, we can pin together the neck baffle and draw up the drawstring around each of our necks. It took a little bit of planning to get it all in place, but then I top stitched it down and it looked great. The finishing touch was to add snaps onto the corner and the neck baffle so that they could be snapped together in cold weather. It was a little bit tricky to get the snap through the fabric, and I didn't want to poke a big hole that could later on let down out, but it all worked out in the end. So here's the final quilt. It's 180 centimeters or 71 inches long and 220 centimeters or about 86 inches wide. It has a sewn foot box with 2 pad attachment buckles on the back, so it can be attached to pad straps when it's a little bit cold. The neck baffle provides a seal between our heads, and with a combination of a snap and drawstring at the head, we can seal ourselves in cold weather. I expect this quilt to be okay down to around -4 degrees Celsius or 25 degrees Fahrenheit with the correct ground insulation. The total weight of the quilt is 840 grams or 29.6 ounces, which is a great weight for a sleep system for 2 people. Overall, it took me about 11 hours over 2 days to make, plus planning time beforehand. Thanks for watching my quilt build video. If you enjoyed it and you'd like to see more videos of me making my own gear and then heading outdoors to test it out, please subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my pack prototype build video and making my own raincoat.